If you're someone who just goes about your business, choosing to focus on more important things than the ever-changing automotive landscape, honestly, I envy you. While out and about, you probably enjoy normal things like people watching. We car enthusiasts prefer car watching. It's a strange problem, even a small trip to the grocery store could be full of gossip, jealousy, and judgment. Oh my God, look at that trunk. If you happen to be a pathetic fellow car watcher, perhaps you've noticed the most obvious change in cars and trucks and SUVs over the past 20, 40, 60 years, and that is that they just keep getting bigger. I can't tell you how many times I couldn't park my van in a spot because some gigantic SUV was taking up more than his fair share. Even suburban settings at this point aren't made for these absolute land yachts, but it's even worse when you travel into the city. These kinds of vehicles just don't fit. Let's take trucks, for example. The Toyota Tundra came out in the year 2000. It was 217.5 inches long, 75.2 inches wide, and 70.5 inches tall. Today's Tundra is 233.6 inches long, 80.2 inches wide, and 78 inches tall. It's 35% heavier, and its overall mass is roughly 25% more, though the Tundra wasn't quite as big as, say, an F-150 or Chevy Silverado back in 2000. It was Toyota's full-sized pickup meant to compete with those trucks, but by today's standard, it would barely be considered mid-sized. A modern Tacoma is larger than the original Tundra in almost every way. Since 2000, Ford and Chevy's full-sized and mid-sized trucks have grown at a slightly slower rate, though trucks and cars from, say, the 1970s are significantly smaller compared to their modern counterparts. It's not just that average sedans and trucks and SUVs are getting bigger, the very largest vehicles that can be bought are getting way bigger. Though not literally twice the size, a modern Grand Wagoneer feels twice the size of anything that was on the road in, say, the 1970s. It is twice as substantial, let's say. 40 inches longer than the original Grand Wagoneer. 40 inches, think about that. Nearly twice the interior space, about 10 inches wider and taller, and weighing some 55% more. The Suburban was probably the largest overall vehicle that money could buy back in the 70s, and today it would be considered mid-sized with our, land yacht Wagoneers and Escalades, and of course modern Suburbans. Sedans have grown as well, but not quite as much, but because fewer drivers are choosing sedans, opting instead for large SUVs regardless of how big their family is, especially here in the West, it makes it so that when you're out on the road, it really just feels like cars are so big. This change, not only in the approach from manufacturers, but also just consumer preference, is pretty complex, but I do think that we can make sense of it all. At the dawn of the automobile, cars were primarily a luxury item for the wealthy. Of course, all of this would change with the Model T and its successors, which were small and simple, designed with practicality in mind. The Model T, introduced in 1908, was affordable, compact, and efficient, being less than 5 feet wide and around 13 feet long. Designed to haul multiple people with luggage, though today it would fall nicely into the sort of small crossover category. The Model T's size really was a reflection of the economic realities of the early 20th century, where most roads were narrow and consumers were looking for vehicles that were simple to maintain and afford, and also simple to store. After World War II, the United States experienced an economic boom that radically altered the car industry. This prosperity of the post-war era led to an explosion of consumer demand for cars, and the American car market quickly shifted towards larger, more luxurious vehicles. This period saw the rise of iconic models like the Chevrolet Bel Air, and these cars were large, powerful, and they were often seen as symbols of status and wealth. The American car culture embraced the idea that bigger was categorically better. Bigger engines, bigger interior, and just more features. Cars like these were typically over 16 feet long, close to 6 feet wide, which was massive compared to most pre-war vehicles. Quite a few different factors really contributed to this trend. With economic prosperity, consumers are willing to spend more to get more, so for manufacturers, why not make more, if that makes sense. Post-war innovations in automotive engineering allowed for more powerful engines and for larger bodies. The increased availability of steel made it easier to manufacture these bigger vehicles. As more Americans moved to suburban areas, they wanted larger vehicles to accommodate their families and their lifestyles. During this time, the idea of the car as kind of a status symbol really became deeply ingrained in American culture, with consumers increasingly equating larger cars with prestige and comfort and just success. And this is something that would carry on in American culture to today. Now, in the 1960s and into the early 70s, things got pretty wild. Muscle cars grew in size and power. Full-size cars like the Cadillac Eldorado and the Chevrolet Impala were over 18 feet long and were powered by massive V8 engines. But then something happened. The 1970s would mark a major shift in the industry in terms of size. The oil crisis of 1973 changed the way Americans thought about their vehicles. The global oil shortage made it clear that fuel efficiency was no longer just a luxury, but it was a necessity. Consumers began to demand smaller, more fuel-efficient cars that could help them cope with rising gas prices. In response, American automakers started producing smaller vehicles, and of course, foreign manufacturers like Toyota and Honda took advantage of the demand for compact cars by introducing models like the Corolla and the Civic. These vehicles were smaller in size, lighter, and more fuel efficient, making them really a nice alternative to those big, giant, gas-guzzling American cars from the 60s. While larger sedans and SUVs of the 1960s and 70s did remain popular, the overall trend of the decade was towards downsizing in response to both the oil crisis and also just the shifting economic landscape. Now, by the 80s and 90s, the American car market had largely recovered from the oil crisis, and vehicles began to once again grow in size, but for different reasons. During this period, consumer preferences shifted back to larger cars as people began to prioritize comfort and utility over fuel economy. The SUV boom of the 1990s also began during this time, with models like the Ford Explorer and the Chevy Suburban really becoming popular. These vehicles were not just bigger, they also offered features that appealed to families, more interior space and greater cargo capacity. We also saw the luxury SUV market explode as automakers realized the potential profit of combining the ruggedness of an SUV with the luxury features of high-end sedans, and so vehicles like the Range Rover and the Jeep Grand Cherokee really became popular. The 2000s and especially the 2010s are where things got really wild. SUVs weren't just bigger, they were well on their way to replacing vans and station wagons as the preferred family vehicle. But this more recent shift in focus on the part of manufacturers and the change in consumer preference is really pretty unique compared to other shifts in terms of size from automotive history. First, let's talk about safety standards. In terms of safety innovations, there aren't very many that have matched this concept of the crumple zone, which was first introduced in the 60s and 70s. Essentially, these are areas of the car that absorb and also dissipate energy in the event of a crash instead of transferring, the full force of a crash directly into the passenger compartment. Now, it seems counterintuitive, but, a hard sort of bulletproof design is actually much less safe for passengers than a fragile car, so to speak. You want the main frame to be rigid, but you want the body to take most of the impact. Maximizing this safety concept means more overall space on and inside the car, and as a result, modern vehicles have longer front and rear overhangs and more structure surrounding the cabin than older cars. This is a huge reason why a Honda Accord that is modern looks just so different from a Honda Accord from, say, the 90s. Spec-wise, this car isn't necessarily that much larger, but it feels significantly larger. Beyond just crumple zones, nearly every aspect of design for improving overall safety has made cars larger. Larger passenger cells, side impact standards, has led to thicker doors, stronger B-pillars, and more structural reinforcements across the chassis. Stricter rollover standards has led to stronger roofs and heavier pillars and just additional bracing in the roofline and in the floor pan. Requirements for withstanding overlapping frontal impacts, where only part of the front of the car strikes another object, has pushed designers towards wider wider vehicle stances and reinforced structures across a broader front end. Modern cars have things like front airbags and also side airbags and curtain airbags and knee airbags and even rear seat airbags. In these systems, they add weight, they add complexity, and they make vehicles just larger. Things like automatic emergency braking and lane keeping assist and adaptive cruise control, collision warning systems, all of these things require extra sensors and cameras and sometimes radar units, and these just make the overall mass of the car larger. In short, cars must on some level be larger to be safer. If you think some old heavy 70s car could fare well in a crash up against a modern vehicle, you're crazy. These changes in design have made cars bulkier, but they've also made them safer. But, it's not all so pure. There is no talking about modern automotive development and the shift toward larger vehicles without recognizing the role of the CAFE standards, that is, corporate average fuel economy. The CAFE standards played a significant role in pushing manufacturers towards developing more fuel-efficient vehicles, but the way it does this has in many ways worked against the original goals. So here's how it works. At a basic level, CAFE standards require each manufacturer's fleet of vehicles to meet a sales-weighted average fuel economy target. These targets are set separately for passenger cars and light trucks, which includes not only pickups but also SUVs and vans. And they're measured in miles per gallon. Automakers are fined if their fleets do not meet these benchmarks, though the penalties are often small compared to the profits that are made from selling, potentially less efficient vehicles. Since 2011, under a revision introduced during the Obama administration, CAFE targets have been tied to vehicle footprint, a measurement defined as the area between the wheels, calculated as the wheelbase multiplied by the average track width. This approach replaced the previous system that imposed uniform miles per gallon standards across all vehicles regardless of their size. Now, this footprint-based system means that larger vehicles are allowed to have lower fuel economy targets while smaller vehicles must meet higher targets. Now, I've talked about this, but this is why, we don't have small trucks anymore, for example, because they can't really be made. Now, the logic behind this was to preserve consumer choice. It would be politically and economically difficult to regulate large vehicles just out of existence, so by assigning miles per gallon targets based on footprint, regulators were trying to push all vehicles towards greater efficiency within their size classes. Now, at a surface level, it seems to kind of be a smart compromise. The problem is it opened the door for automakers to just make bigger vehicles. Since larger vehicles are held in lower miles per gallon targets, manufacturers realized that they could just design vehicles with larger and larger footprints to lower the fuel economy bar that they needed to clear. This is why vehicles in general don't actually have better miles per gallon than, say, cars from really the early 2000s. It's not that automakers can't get to better miles per gallon numbers. It's just not all that savvy for their business to do so. It's much smarter for them to just make bigger vehicles for the American market. And this has actually limited consumer options. And it's made it so that American automakers don't even really make cars anymore. It's all just big SUVs and, of course, trucks. Vehicle designs are widened or lengthened just enough to bump into that larger footprint category, and therefore the required miles per gallon goes down. So it makes it easier and cheaper for automakers to meet their CAFE targets without actually making specific improvements in engine efficiency or investing in hybrid or electric drivetrains. Simply put, the key to meeting regulatory demands of supposedly economic vehicles is to just make gigantic SUVs and trucks. Pretty dumb if you think about it. Some refer to this as the SUV loophole. SUVs aren't really trucks, but because they're classified as trucks and therefore have less standards really in every way, that's what the American automakers want to focus on. Now, the problem is that in this loophole, light trucks, as they're classified, or SUVs, are not subject to the same safety standards. So though there are companies who still focus on safety standards for their SUVs and, for vans, think of companies like Tesla and Kia, many popular SUVs actually fail miserably in tests. For example, the small overlap test. The irony of all this is that consumers in general, especially here in the United States, believe that these bigger, heavier vehicles are safer simply because of their size. Now, there is some logic to this. If we all drive massive vehicles, you and your little Camry are in danger, but SUVs are more rollover prone, Of course, they're more dangerous for pedestrians because they have much worse visibility. But even for those who are in the vehicle, these sort of land yacht SUVs, they have significantly worse stopping time and maneuverability. And there are studies showing that drivers of larger vehicles just take more risks in general. They feel a bit more indestructible. All of this benefits automakers. They prefer to make larger vehicles like trucks and SUVs because they're way more profitable than smaller cars. Obviously, larger vehicles often cost much more than sedans to buy, but they don't necessarily cost that much more to make and produce. Once the basic engineering is done, the platform, the engine, building a full-size SUV versus a mid-sized car doesn't double the manufacturing cost, but it can double the sales price. So that just means fatter margins for manufacturers. On top of this, trucks and SUVs are easy to load up with expensive features, leather interiors, premium sound systems, massive touchscreen displays, or off-road packages, towing equipment. Buyers are willing to spend $10K or more above the base price without blinking on these large vehicles. And so the extra profit for manufacturers, it's just harder to squeeze out of a small car buyer. Now, because larger, more expensive vehicles make automakers more money, they're marketed heavily, especially to suburban families. This is why every SUV commercial feels partially like a van ad and partially like it's geared toward off-road enthusiasts. It's all about this idea of adventure and quality time, and subtly the idea is also status. Large SUVs and trucks are now symbols of success, especially here in America. We as consumers have a sort of complex. We think that we need gigantic cars because they make us feel bigger, and of course automakers know this, so they just confirm it for us. Now listen, big vehicles are fine. It's not a problem that large vehicles exist. Large cars and trucks have always served a purpose, especially here in America, whether it's hauling cargo or hauling supplies or hauling a whole bunch of humans. The problem is that few consumers here in America see the real benefits of owning a smaller vehicle. But I think there is hope for those of us who miss when cars were a bit smaller and when there were just more options for those wanting more economical vehicles that don't take up the entire garage. Just a few days ago, EV startup Slate unveiled their truck platform, which is an incredibly simple electrical vehicle that kind of throws off the norm in terms of tech and features. It's bare bones, and because of this, it's also very small, smaller than just about anything on the road, much more like an American K-truck than any American trucks coming out of Detroit. Now, I think there's going to be a resurgence in demand for these kinds of vehicles as people are spending less, and they're going to realize that simple vehicles meant only to get you from point A to point B reliably and without hassle. There are, pros to these kinds of vehicles. I mean, think about how fewer problems a vehicle like that Slate truck will have simply because there's no complicated electronics or software systems. It's basically just a giant road legal golf cart. If most of us moved more towards vehicles like this, as well as, two-stroke mopeds, the world would be a better place. Well, I would love to hear from you guys. Do you think that there's more to this giant vehicle epidemic? Maybe you're a big vehicle guy or girl too, and that's fine. We'll allow you to comment as well. And I'd also like to hear where you think the future is heading in terms of the automotive industry. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one. Drive safe.